6 mistakes that 6 sensories make with their 5 sensory partners in serious long-term relationships. And there is a bit of a difference. The number one mistake that 6 sensories make when they're in a relationship with a 5 sensory is that they assume that the 5 sensory is falling in love with them when they communicate and spend time with them. That is actually not the case. 5 sensories more likely will fall in love with an absence of your presence, an absence of your communication, rather than the actual communication or the event that's happening in the moment when you're spending quality time. Now, having said that, you have to be careful. That doesn't mean you want to completely ignore 5 sensories. There has to be some quality time there. There has to be some communication there. You can't completely ghost them because that doesn't work either. Having said that, 6 sensories assume that when they are really engaged in that quality time, in that moment with that 5 sensory, and they are going to create a loving relationship in the long term, and they don't realize that they're overdoing it by going on too many dates or they're communicating too much, and then that mystery goes away, and that absence that makes the heart grow fonder, or that mystery, is what makes 5 sensories fall in love with 6 sensories. If you spend too much time together, you're actually going to mess things up rather than spending some time apart. So let the 5 sensory initiate. That's a really good way of determining when you should be hanging out with them or communicating with them. That's showing you that they're ready for a little bit more action, right? Rather than needing their space. So when they tell you they want more from you, that's a good indicator that that's the right timing, that you do want to spend more quality time and communicate more with the 5 sensory. The next mistake that 6 sensories make in their relationships with 5 sensories is that they think they can change the 5 sensory. And you've probably heard this one before. You can't really change anyone ever, and trying to change people is just totally futile. Where you do have a bit more control is in the dating stage. So if you don't like what a 5 sensory is doing as a 6 sensory, you can be more absent. You can step back. You can't really complain or tell the 5 sensory about it, but they do respond when you are not so present. And you have a little bit more control over this when you're in that dating stage. When you're married, this is a bit harder to do because you're literally in the same living quarters. So you can't just disappear on the 5 sensory. You can find creative ways to be a bit more absent than normal, even when you're in the same household in a marriage or a long-term relationship, right? So be creative in that case and find other ways to have a bit of distance when you're not happy with somebody, to create a boundary. But having said that, don't do it in a passive-aggressive way. Don't verbalize it. Just be very natural and be very gentle about those boundaries. And that's the way you can enforce your boundaries and send the 5 sensory a message that you didn't like their behavior, but without telling them to change. The next mistake that 6 sensories make in their relationship with 5 sensories is that they also assume that they fall in love when they share all their hobbies and activities together. That is some old relationship advice, that you have to have things in common that you can spend time together doing. And this is to a certain extent true. You do need some activities that you share together. Allow the 5 sensory to initiate what those activities are. Don't try to force your hobbies or your activities as a 6 sensory onto the 5 sensory, because it's very likely they're not going to enjoy the same activities as you do. If they really insist that they want to participate, then you can let them participate if it comes from them. But don't force your hobbies or your activities on them if they haven't initiated and asked to be a part of those hobbies and activities. That's another big mistake that 6 sensories make when they're in a relationship with their 5 sensory partner. The next mistake that 6 sensories make, and this is an interesting one, and it really depends on what phase of the relationship you're into, is that if you're in a marriage or long-term relationship where you're intimate regularly, the biggest mistake is that a 6 sensory cuts off all intimacy when a 5 sensory makes a mistake as a form of revenge long-term. Now, you can kind of get away with this in a long-term relationship or marriage If the five sensory does something offensive, let's say they go to your mother's and they say something like your mother looks like she's very tired or an old hag or something, and they say something really wrong that they really shouldn't have said. When you come home from that encounter, you can actually say, hey, I don't really feel like intimacy tonight. That's perfectly valid and perfectly okay. But when you're doing it as like an act of revenge, like I'm never going to be intimate with you again after that kind of encounter, like for 6 weeks after, that's not good. You shouldn't be doing that. Intimacy is not a tool for revenge or a tool for boundaries. It's just part of a happy, healthy relationship when you've entered that phase of the relationship. And so you can't use it to control people. Having said that, it's a little different in the dating phase. There, you've got a bit more control over how much intimacy you want to give a particular partner. And if they're not behaving well, but it's not bad enough for you to break off the connection completely, you do not have to be intimate at this time. You can wait until a longer term commitment is made, and that's perfectly valid. But it really depends. Once you're sort of in the habit of becoming intimate, it's harder to pull it away, because then it's easy to get into that rhythm into your relationship and it feels natural. And when you pull it away, it can seem really artificial and unnatural, like you're trying to get revenge or do something negative to the five sensory partner. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're not sure about a person when you're getting to know them, you don't know if they're going to behave badly or not, then it may not be time for intimacy at that moment. You may want to wait until you've got a better sense of their character. My next tip, in order to avoid making mistakes as a sixth sensory in your relationship with a five sensory partner, is don't share your bodily functions or too much information of any kind with your five sensory partner. And it's kind of hard to define too much information in a lot of situations, but a bodily function is a good one. Like, you don't want to share your bowel movements or your farts or your urinary stuff with five sensories. This is probably not a good idea. Or your period, that's another one. Your fertility or whatever it is. It's probably not a good idea to share that information too early on with a five sensory, unless it's absolutely necessary to communicate. Like, you need to communicate something related to your intimacy because maybe you're not on birth control, something like that. If it's essential information, absolutely communicate it, but don't communicate detail that is not essential to a five sensory about your bodily functions. They do not need to know about this. And too much information could even be like, you feel really insecure about your body and therefore you're working out really hard to make sure you're losing weight. Don't share this with the five sensory either. It's not a good idea, because that can give them ammo to pick on you. Whereas they may have never noticed that extra little bit of weight you had, that you're working to get rid of. So don't share too much information about things that are your vulnerabilities or are very personal to the five sensory, even when you're in a relationship with a five sensory, because it eliminates the mystery, even if it is safe, and the five sensory is not going to retaliate or use that information in a bad way. It still kind of messes up a long-term relationship because it takes away your mystery, which is part of the power of being attractive in the first place. So it's better to leave as much as you can private. That doesn't mean keeping secrets, but it does mean being very discerning about what kinds of information you share with a five sensory. You don't need to share every single detail of your day. You don't need to communicate everything. Just try to be disciplined in your communication and keep it as simple as possible, and don't share too much with them. And then my next and final mistake that six sensories make in their five sensory relationships is that they complain about the five sensory being bad, or not being attractive enough, or having poor moral character, or they're not working hard enough to earn money. If you truly feel like you want to complain about the five sensory and they're not good enough, then why are you having a relationship with them, right? The only real way you can communicate what you don't like is by ending the relationship. If it's like a permanent character trait that you don't like, then that's your choices. You shouldn't engage in that relationship anymore if you really don't like it, or you just accept it for what it is as a quirk in the relationship. And if it's not that bad, if it's something you find kind of weird, but it's not horrible, like maybe they really love going and watching Marvel movies all the time after work or something like that. it can be just part of the quirk, part of the relationship, you know, and you don't have to turn it into such a bad thing or such an evil thing, but it depends what it is. If it is a really like bad moral trait, then you shouldn't be getting intimately involved in this person in the first place. And you really need to monitor and check people out when you're in the dating phase before you get involved with them, so you don't really find out later that they're a crook or that they're a terrible person when you're married. I know sometimes people get deceived and they end up married, and then they're facing a really tough choice if they later uncover that their partner isn't a good person. In that case, it's very hard. It's up to your discernment to decide what you want to do in that situation, and you may need more guidance and more coaching on that to really know the exact right thing to do, if it's worth living with or if it's something you must absolutely divorce over.